we lucked out so much on the fact that these actors, none of them like walked out after a couple of days and well, you guys crazy, and just walked out of the movie. We definitely, the whole movie was basically, safely torturing these actors.
He hasn't spoken a word.
Hello, creeps. It's your old pal, the Crypt Keeper. And you are now tuned in to my good fiends at Talks From The Crypt, the most gruesome podcast in the world.
Okay, Eduardo and Dan. Well, first and foremost, thank you guys so much for coming on to Talks From The Crypt today. How are you guys?
Doing good, man. Good to be here.
Man. Yeah, thanks for having us.
How long has it been since you guys have done an interview together?
It's been a while. I can't remember the last time. Not too long ago, but we don't do it regularly, so it's nice to be on the line at the same time,
Oh yeah, it's been a while. It's like we did probably 50,000 of them during the Blair heyday and all. So, but yeah, it's been a while since we've done one together.
Well, it's nice to see you guys in the same room. I mean, even in doing research in this, the only interviews I was finding together was like back in 1999.
Yeah. Like Dan said, we did like thousands of interviews together. But then since then, we kind of have our own careers and we just kind of been separate. But every once in a while we come together and do some Blair Witch stuff. So it's always good to hang out.
Right. And are you guys tired of talking about this at all yet? 24 years later?
Not really for me. It got sort of redundant, during a few years after Blair Witch, where you're kind of answering the same questions and over and over and over. But I'm kind of at a place now where it's, I am very proud of Blair and the fact that it's had on people, and it's nice to see a younger generation of kids kind of embracing the film, and it's more nostalgic for me, and it reminds me of a time when I was younger and kind of stupid, and we didn't know what the hell we were doing, and so I have very fond memories of those days. So time has a way of just sort of evening things out. So I like talking about it because I don't have to really do it that much anymore. So it's kind of nice to reminisce.
Yeah, for me, I agree with Dan. It's like, I feel blessed to have been a part of this movie, and like it gave me a career, and I'm talking, we're talking to you because of this movie. And I always tell people, like, because I get that question every time somebody wants to approach me about Blair Witch, and I'm like, if you want to talk to me about a movie, we did almost 25 years ago, then why would I not want to talk to you about it? So that's kind of my attitude, is like, I love talking about it. It's what connected me to film business, and like I said earlier, gave me a career, and I'm very again blessed to have been a part of it.
I think both Ed and I at a certain point when things sort of transitioned into sort of kind of otherworldly popularity for the film, that there was, in a way, we were as much spectators as anybody else was when the thing kind of blew up. We were like so out of our element, and we were like, what the hell is going on? And even as sort of a outside observer, kind of looking at Blair as a case study of what happened, it's very interesting and fascinating to me because it can be applied to a lot of films and stuff like that since. But so on one sense, it's very current because it, that publicity and the approach and doing something honestly I don't think ever goes out of style, and it feels very current for me. But at the same time, the actual action, when I look at pictures of us back in those days and how young we were, and it feels like pretty distant in that regard at the same time.
Yeah, and both of us have, raised kids and, got married, and, all these things have happened. But it does seem like a long time ago. But it is weird because like I never thought that, I never imagined that I would be associated with a film that people are like, like yourselves are still talking about, 25 years later. Like, again, I feel humbled that I was a part of it. And I think, Dan feels the same way. It was like this thing where like, It was just a good idea that we thought, and it was within our budgetary constraints to make it. And then, like Dan said, we kind of just sat back and watched this thing explode. And part of it was like, you know, we were just on the sidelines, you know, and letting this monster kind of roll out. But you know, it was such an important part of our lives, and you know, you know, never will be forgotten. But again, it does, like Dan said, it does feel like a long time ago.
Yeah, and you know, you guys were so ahead of the curve. You know, nowadays with TikTok, viral marketing campaigns are like every other day. You know, Skinamarink just came out and that went absolutely viral. You know, obviously Paranormal Activity being one of the bigger ones, but you know, your guys' movie literally paved the way for that. And you guys were really ahead of the curve when it came to internet use in 1999. What were some of the strategies behind that, and how did you guys, did you guys know ahead of time about anything going viral? Was that even a thing in 99?
We just happened to be at the right place at the right time, and we had no money, so the internet was kind of our only way to get any kind of word out there. And so we built this website, and people started coming to it, and everything we did was kind of instinctual, and also based on the idea that we had no money. So it was mostly just homegrown, you know, marketing, and also just people. You know, for us, unexpectedly, there's so many people around the world that like started championing our little movie even before they saw it. They just loved the story and they loved our approach. But for us, it was just like, okay, we're doing this, you know, again, a fake documentary. We didn't want to call it a fake documentary, but that's what we were making. And, you know, so how would you, if you had if you were making a real documentary, how would you build a website for it? So we just kind of followed our instincts. And then luckily for us, you know, Artisan, the company that bought the movie, was, you know, they were very kind of open to doing a lot of cutting edge stuff and kind of taking risks. And they just kind of, you know, let us kind of go, and they were really good collaborators with us. So once the movie started to be marketed, they were really open to our kind of wacky ideas that, you know, a lot of places would have been like, no, we can't do that, you know. But again, it was just kind of, you know, luck, the fact that the internet was a certain size, you know, wasn't too big to disprove us, but was just big enough to like spread the you know, the misinformation. You know, so I think that's, you know, that combined with just luck, you know, kind of built this bubble of marketing that, you know, again, like Dan said earlier, we kind of, at a certain point, we just kind of sat back and said, holy crap, what the hell's going on, you know?
Right. And we also didn't really know what the rules were. You know, we weren't, you know, experienced enough filmmakers to really know to be bogged down with what we should or shouldn't do as far as the industry was concerned. And we were just, you know, kind of like grasping at whatever we could afford. And I think, you know, Ed touched on to it about the, you know, budget constraints. You know, Earthlink at the time, they gave you like a free web page. So we didn't have any money to really advertise the film in any way. So, you know, Ed's kind of built this little web page because it didn't really cost us anything but our time. So that made sense to us. And the whole sort of fact or fiction approach, we just thought was kind of cool and fun, and it sort of just caught on. So a lot of it, like Ed was saying, it was driven by instinct and budgetary constraints. But also a naivete that we weren't following any established path because we didn't really know what the hell we were doing.
Well, I mean, sometimes that just works out to your favor. You know, ignorance truly is bliss.
Yeah.
I tend to overthink a lot of the projects I get into because you find yourself subconsciously framing it into what you think it should be. And, you know, this was just something that was so original at the time. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, in researching this, we found that there's a discussion. Now, I was born in 93. Movie came out in 99. So I was very young when this movie dropped. And to me, it was the creator of found footage. It was the first that I had seen. Now, you got people saying that, you know, no, Cannibal Holocaust was. I don't know about you guys, but when I watch Cannibal Holocaust, I know that's a movie.
I mean, it's interesting because, you know, after Blair Witch came out, someone approached us and said, "Hey, have you seen, you know, Cannibal Holocaust?" We hadn't even seen the movie, again, going back to how kind of clueless we were at the time, but you know, on paper, the premise is very similar to Blair, and one can still argue to this day how much of it was, you know, legit or not, or what have you. But I think I speak for Ed that, you know, we never made the claim that we invented the genre or invented the found footage, you know, conceit or anything like that. Blair certainly popularized it and broke it into the mainstream. I would, you know, argue that a film like Cannibal Holocaust is not really a mainstream kind of movie. But Blair Witch definitely took that conceit and elevated it to, you know, to being consumable by more and more people than any other film of its time. So I don't think I don't lay claim that we invented or pioneered that style or that genre, but it's certainly Blair Witch helped popularize it, and a lot of people associate it with this sort of being the kind of the originator. But there were other films out that did it. I mean, even Man Bites Dog and films like that are sort of in that space. And what inspired Ed and I for the film, like In Search Of, and, you know, 70s era films that were sort of bordering on truth or not, you know, we were inspired by those kinds of shows and films that were playing around with that conceit long before Blair.
Yeah, and you know, when we saw Cannibal Holocaust, you know, I remember the day, you know, we were just sitting there watching it, and I don't even think we finished it because, you know, it's a kind of a rough movie to watch. You know, certain scenes are kind of hard to watch, just very cruel. But you know, at least for me, and I don't know if we talked about this, Dan, but we probably did, but I just felt like, you know, if we had seen Cannibal Holocaust when we were kids, because, you know, a lot of people, Cannibal Holocaust was kind of this tape that was going around, like people were kind of passing it around the early days of VHS, kind of like in our high school, it was Faces of Death. It was this movie, like people were passing this around, and Cannibal Holocaust never made it into our circles, you know, and, but I always tell people, like, if we had seen Cannibal Holocaust, you know, I think we would have come across this idea and been like, well, they already did that, so let's do something else. So I really don't think that, because, you know, the premise of, you know, pretty much exactly the same, you know, as Blair Witch. I mean, you know, the execution was very different, but I feel like, you know, we kind of lucked out. Again, it was part of this lucky train that we were on with Blair Witch, that we had never seen Cannibal Holocaust, because I think we would not, I mean, I think I would have been like, well, you know, Cannibal Holocaust already did that. Let's try to find something else. So I think Blair Witch kind of owes its life to our ignorance, you know, about Cannibal Holocaust.
And the lucky train, the lucky train has left the station.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, you know, the film's inception and the storyline, I mean, you know, the act of going into the woods to find something unknown or horrifying, I guess I could see the similarities, but the originality of the story and just everything surrounding the lore and mythology of the Blair Witch, you know, where did that idea come from? Where did that story come from? Were there any kind of, I know you're saying the In Search Of shows you guys used to watch, but were there any kind of stories you used to hear as a kid about the woods that kind of fueled this idea? Because it's very detailed.
Ed and I had an original nugget. I remember being, I think it was at your apartment, Ed, at UCF, when we were talking about, you know, describing this shot where you're kind of walking through the woods and you can't pull away. It's like a documentary first-person perspective of this camera going through the dark woods, and then you come upon this house. And that just kind of, we had chills through our veins when we kind of talked about that moment, that scene, and things sort of kind of grew from that description and that idea and that sort of immediacy of that first person perspective. But I have to credit like our team, you know, back in the days of Haxon, Mike Manello and Greg Hale and Ben Rock and Christian Guevara. I mean, these are guys, they're super creative filmmakers themselves that were helping to kind of flesh out this world building that we were finding ourselves doing as we kind of created this core premise of an idea, but we wanted to have this mythology that it was all supporting. So a lot of these guys that came on board a little bit later on helped build out some of that mythology. And again, it was all growing organically. It was sort of like taking on a life of its own. And as it, we put up the website, and Ed was kind of populating this stuff with a lot of the stuff that we shot. The audience, our kind of core audience, was sort of like contributing as well, giving us feedback. So it wasn't anything that we had this grand idea at the beginning. What was so nice about Blair, and you don't get often get a chance to do that later in your career, is that it just grew really organically and had a lot of collaboration in that process, which is one of the things I do miss a lot, is that you're never kind of in that kind of environment, that collegiate environment where everyone's just sort of in it for all the right reasons, and they're just doing it because it's so freaking cool. But yeah, that world building came pretty organically as we needed to fill in gaps of the storyline and all. A lot of our guys helped kind of fill that out.
Right. And do you feel like that collaboration spirit has kind of left in terms of the movie industry? I mean, has it changed since you guys started?
No, I just think that like when you start getting paid to do the work that we were doing for free, like Dan was saying, it was just basically the joy, it was just a joy. We were just doing this thing and we loved it. We loved the idea. We were like young filmmakers. We were naive. We were going to, blaze into the film business. I think once you get paid, you have to kind of, it becomes different. And I tell people, I tell people this all the time who are, in film school, is like, just take advantage of the collaboration that you can do now. And like, the fact that you're not getting paid to do what you really want to do, because once you start getting paid, everything changes. And, you still can do collaborations, but it just takes, it's a different kind of thing. Again, once everybody starts looking for a paycheck and you do a certain amount of work for free, and then you're like, well, I'm wasting my time because I could be doing something for work. And you have again, you become an adult and you have to start paying your mortgage. Back then, we were just basically trying to, pay the rent and have not have our utilities cut, every month. We were definitely tight on cash, but it wasn't like our main thing, our main reason for doing this. So just things change, but you can still find good collaborations. It just becomes, it's a little bit of a different, feeling. I mean, sometimes, and sometimes I think my best collaborations, I think Dan does the same thing, is you collaborate with people that aren't, that are starting out, you writers that aren't signed, or you find a script or a website that you really like, and you reach out to them and you start, like I've been building this idea with this guy that I met online who plays this little character named Bleeding Critic, and he just like reviewed one of my films and I really loved what he did, so I reached out to him, and for like the last 3 or 4 years we've just been developing this idea and involving other people, all for free, and we're about to attach a showrunner and hopefully go out after the strike that's going to happen. We think things are going to be kind of in the next couple of months, or everything's kind of shutting down because of the writer's strike, the possible writer's strike. But afterwards, we're going to go out and pitch it. So, you do have these kinds of collaborations still, but it's harder to find once everybody, is looking for a paycheck.
Have you guys worked together at all since the Blair Witch, or no?
Well, we wrote a script together. Yeah, right. Well, I'm in Seattle and he's in Maryland, so it's just geographically it's challenging. But we collaborated on a script for a sequel to Blair Witch a few years afterwards with Lionsgate that ended up not getting picked up. So and also on several raw feed projects we did for Warner Brothers. So we had some collaborations post Blair Witch. Nothing as of late. Ed's been super busy and successful in the television space. He's been doing a lot of series work there, and I've have been myself working more in the documentary space, which I've found pretty rewarding. But yeah, I mean, as soon as Ed gets that rash cleared up, then maybe we can get together and and
eventually it'll clear up. That's what the my doctors say. Yeah, Dan and I were, we were friends, and we were like kind of in film school. We got to know each other, and we, dug each other's films. And then, we kind of stumbled onto Blair Witch, and, Blair Witch became something that, nobody could ever predict it was going to become. And it was like a huge explosion, in our lives. And, for the good and the bad, we were still really young, trying to figure things out. And I think everybody, all the guys in Haxon that, made the Blair Witch, it was just really difficult collaborating after that. There was, we wrote this really funny script called Heart of Love after Blair Witch. And, we almost got it made. We got it financed, but then that's a whole different other podcast. But a lot of problems started coming up with it, and eventually everybody started backing out of it. And I think Dan and I were just in a weird space. I think that with all the pressures of Blair Witch, it was just a lot. It was a lot for these guys, for us, that we had just we went to this like unknown film school and got to know each other and made these things again, like with the spirit of collaboration. And I think once the money started being made and, the agents, and I remember one time, this is just kind of an example, I feel, of what happened. One of our agents, and I remember the moment, we were like, I think we were in San Francisco, and they took us on this retreat. I don't know what the hell it was. And one of the agents was just out in the open, we were all just eating, and he's like, I still haven't figured out which one of you guys is the really talented one. So that to a young, to guys, I was in my early 30s, Dan was in his mid 30s, very naive to the business. That really messes with your mind. And I remember Dan and I having conversations about even before Blair Witch, about not feeling like the Ringo of the group, not to disparage Ringo, because one of the best drummers ever, but and the Beatles
will probably outlive all the Beatles.
Yeah, well, we'll outlive everybody, but without Lennon McCartney, there wouldn't be the Beatles. So I think Dan and I were always like, I don't want to be the Ringo of this group, because we were a pretty talented group of people. So I think that, it just kind of screwed with us. And then Heart of Love kind of fell apart. And like Dan said, we moved to different, sides of the country. And I think everybody had to kind of rediscover themselves and figure out where they belonged in this film business, And I think Dan and I had been connected for so long, and I think it just had to be, there had to be a moment of just like us kind of breaking apart and finding our own way. And I'd love to collaborate again, with him. I think we could still do something cool. It's just right now, the opportunity hasn't come up, but eventually I think in the future we'll end up doing something together.
Right. Well, hopefully this acts as a sign. And, with what I find intriguing is that with Halloween, Deborah Hill and John Carpenter brought two different things to the table. Deborah Hill brought, Laurie and all of the high school portions of the movie, while John Carpenter kind of wrote, the idea of the shape and, made Michael Myers who he is. And, I'm sure it's easier zooming out 25 years later. I mean, what did Eduardo bring? What did Dan bring? I mean, because your guys' minds together created something special. I'm curious, what do you guys see you gave most to the story?
I mean, it's really hard to say. It's impossible. I mean, the one thing I can say with Ed and myself, and it was something that was, fairly evident to me in film school, and Ed is, one of the few people that really challenges me. Sometimes I'll think I've got a really good idea, and he'll come at it and say, well, have you thought about this? Or maybe he'll come up with something I didn't even think about. And I think we're really good at taking what someone suggests, what the other suggests, and making it a little bit better. That kind of collaboration is rare. And so I've always appreciated that about him. He just made me a better filmmaker. There's only a handful of people in the world that it's a marriage. Sometimes it's very tough, and sometimes it's, you hear shit you don't want to hear, and you leave the room thinking, man, this guy's coming up with all the best ideas and I'm not, right? So, and you maybe I am the Ringo, right? But at the same time, you tell yourself, well, maybe he's thinking the same thing. So there's a certain sort of like history that you have with somebody that you just kind of know how they think, and they just kind of jive. And we did in film school, we just sort of jived. And whether we were brainstorming ideas for films or just sitting at a party, just goofing off, we always managed to sort of make each other laugh and always one-upped each other. It was just a natural kind of progression with us. So that doesn't happen too often. So yeah, I mean, I'm with that. It would have to be the right project, because at the same time, we're individual filmmakers, I mean, directing is kind of a dictatorship if you really think about it. It's hard to share the final say. It just is. And with Blair Witch, it was a little bit, I mean, even in the edit process, we're like, okay, dude, you cut that scene and I'll cut this scene, and we'll put them together and see what works. Because if you're looking over each other's shoulder, trying to kind of micromanage each other's, cuts, you would never get done. You had to take it in chunks and sort of divide and conquer, even on the edit portion of the film. And the same went for the shooting. We kind of divvied it up. So I think those collaborations can work and be very effective and greater than the sum of its parts, but it's also the kind of project. I think it has to be the right project and the right time, I think, in your life and whatnot. But it was obviously very fruitful. And, but some of my best memories are the ones we had in film school on films that no one will ever see, but because we didn't finish them, I have very, very fond memories of those collaborations, as tough as it was sometimes. And yeah, I do think that, maybe there's something out there that we could work on together in the future, and it might not even be a horror film. It might be a comedy, or it might be an instructional video for, I don't know. It might be a yoga video. Who knows?
Yeah, like an exercise video, I think would be like a series would be great.
The big collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, and now, as far as like Blair Witch, it's just, I mean, there are like individual things that I'm like, oh yeah, Dan came up with that, and I came up with this and that. But it truly was a collaboration of, like, like Dan said, challenging each other. And also we had like this, very clear, like, feeling for this movie. Like we knew what In Search Of was. We knew like Legend of Boggy Creek. Like we knew that world. Like we grew up in that world, and it was something that connected us. So it was very, Blair Witch was it was a tough movie to make. Like all movies are, indie movies are tough to make. But it was an easier collaboration because we had this singular vision. And on anything else, it's very difficult to find that, that vision. So everything, like, we just kind of course corrected each other. And also, the other guys at Hacks, and especially Greg Hale, who like really helped with the production of coming up with the system of, how we were going to keep the actors in the woods. And, he was very much like a third, director. But it was extremely collaborative, all the way, through the marketing and the release of the movie. And like Dan said, it was really special. Like that kind of project doesn't come along, very often.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that stands out with Blair Witch is how incredible the acting was. You guys watch horror movies nowadays, and it's hard for lower budget movies to get as stellar acting as you guys did with Heather, Mike, and Josh. Was that difficult finding them? I mean, you'd think if you're trying to find a less known actor that you could convince an audience that they've died for an entire year, you'd probably cut your talent in half, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we had no shortage of auditions. I mean, there's and one of the things that sort of worked in our favor is, I think fairly early on, we had decided that whatever actors we get, we wanted them to be unknowns. I mean, part of the whole conceit of Blair Witch was to be something that looked real and felt real. So the actors had to have that same sense of realism in their look and their performance, and everything had to come across very naturally. So yeah, I mean, in the audition process, I mean, a large percentage of actors will come in and they're all sort of done up. I mean, we tried our best to sort of like mitigate a lot of wasted time with actors coming in, but they still would come in all dressed up or be all buffed out, and they're doing their big monologues and all that. We quickly flushed those people aside, but Mike, Heather, and Josh, they not only had that quality of natural look and acting, but they had really good improv skills, which was another big prerequisite for us, is because we knew we were going to kind of shoot this thing in an improvisational, at least for the dialogue format. So they had to be able to think on their feet. So we set up a process by which we could kind of screen people in that regard. But it took time. I mean, it was one of those things, even if you find we found a pretty good collection of capable actors, and it's just about what's the chemistry between this group. And it wasn't until later that we even decided to go with Heather as a female. It was originally written as 3 males in the role. So you have to kind of let that process speak to you as much as you speaking to it. And but it does take time. I think a lot of films, like you mentioned, they don't get good actors because they're rushed and they're trying to get to production on such and such a date. So they're just going to settle on what they can get. And if there's one thing I can tell young filmmakers, that don't have a lot of money, I mean, take your time in the casting process. Make sure you get people that have the chops and that can get those performances, because no matter how good your script is, if the performances aren't good, you're just killing yourself. So take the time and get those actors that can pull it off.
Yeah, and again, the serendipity of Blair Witch, we ended up with, the 3 perfect people. It was just just what they brought to the film. Dan and I, never imagined that it was going to be that good. I mean, honestly, there was times when we were just watching the footage and just, with our mouths agape, just because, holy crap, what are we seeing here? So it was, we got lucky. I mean, we looked for a long time for them, but it was, we made our decisions, and it was, there was 3 good decisions there right at the early of, at the beginning of the production that really kind of made our film,
Yeah, I mean, but there were points in the making of this movie where you guys were like, shit, how the fuck is this going to work?
Every day. I mean, every day, it was just because we had no idea what we were doing. We were like, we were going to improvise the dialogue, and we're going to have the actors hold the cameras themselves. And then we came up, Greg came up with the idea of well, why don't we just leave the actors out there for a week? And we were like, can we do that? And sure, we can do that, whatever, and we came up with that system, and every day that system was about to fall apart any minute. We didn't even have permission to stay overnight at the park that we were shooting in, so that was a big thing. And then even during the shooting, we go out there at 1 o'clock in the morning and run around and make noises, and for the shoot, for them freak the actors out, and then walk home at 2 in the morning in the freezing, and looking at each other and going, what the hell are we doing? What kind of movie is this? Is this going to work? Is this going to be a comedy? So the entire thing was an experiment, you know what I mean? And I think we doubted, or at least I doubted myself and what we were doing, almost, multiple times a day.
Yeah. And even after all was said and done, and we kind of had a rough cut of the film together, I mean, I just remember thinking, I don't know if Ed and I really looked at each other literally and said this, but I just I don't know if this is scary. I mean, the whole point of this movie is to make a scary movie. And then looking at scenes where you're just hearing kind of shit in the woods, I'm like, this could be the most boring film on the planet. So I'm not even sure if these moments are scary, because as a filmmaker, you're so close to the content, you're so close to the material, it's hard to be objective about it. So yeah, it was, I mean, I think that just comes with the territory as a filmmaker. You're just constantly doubting yourself. And it's part of, I think, what drives you to work so hard is you're trying to, in some futile way, remove that doubt. Oh, I hit pay dirt, and you never really get there. And I mean, hell, up until the moment where we screened at Sundance, Ed and I were we were down in that damn restroom. Remember, Ed, at the Egyptian? We were in front of the sinks. I was sitting there well, here we go, dude. we have a real audience now of real people that are going to watch our film for the first time, and this may be the beginning or the end of our career. Even then, we weren't sure if it was going to really freaking, be a complete bust or not. It was just, you're just never really sure.
So it took up until the first audience reaction for you guys to realize, like, holy shit, we're cooking with some fire here.
I mean, I knew we were tracking well. I mean, to be honest, we were tracking pretty well. We did some test screenings that went pretty well and all, but I think Sundance for us was like, okay, now this is legit. This is a legit audience, and it's industry types, it's not friends and family or whatever. And, a loaded audience. This is where you're really getting critiqued on the main stage. So, and I think festivals can have a tendency sometimes to be, a little pretentious, and there are those types that just kind of want to, like, okay, these guys are getting some heat, so let's bring them down a notch or two. So you can have that environment sometimes. So that sort of entered into the equation a little bit, but yeah, it was really stressful. You never really know.
Yeah, and also it was the whole idea of, like, are we going to sell this movie? Because we were, we had no money, and we were just, like I always tell people, like, if Blair Witch hadn't sold, I would have probably had to declare personal bankruptcy. I had, like, credit card bills and, student loans, and we weren't making any money by the end of the film, and by the end of the process, and so it was a lot of pressure. But the big thing was, are we going to sell this thing? Are we going to make our money back? Our few investors, are we going to make their money back? So yeah, that was a big. That Dan's right. That was a huge moment for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because If I had just made a movie and it had premiered at Sundance, that would have been like my oh shit moment. That would have been huge for me. But to learn that you guys are still under that pressure, and back to what Dan said earlier about constantly being in a battle with yourself. I mean, I feel like that's all creative people, and it's constantly trying to prove yourself right. So my question is what was that oh shit moment for you guys? I mean, where you guys remember where you were standing? What was it like when you realized this is going to change the scope of the genre forever?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, we knew we had something cool, once we edited and, had started getting reactions from people that had seen the movie. And then obviously once we were accepted at a Sundance, that was like a big thing. But I don't think we ever, at least I never really imagined that it was going to do what it did to, like, the horror genre, or create this like little subgenre of, like, the found footage subgenre. I don't think probably not until years later did I think that kind of, probably when Paranormal Activity started, or maybe when Cloverfield came out, because that was the first, like, found footage kind of hit, after Blair Witch. Did I at least for me, I was like, damn, this thing is gonna, this thing is still, I guess, inspiring people. And that's to me, like, when I realized that there was, there was going to be some longevity to it. But I mean, there's so many times that we were like, really kind of just in awe of what was happening. Like when we got onto the cover of Time magazine and Newsweek on the same week. And when Dan and I were, like, in Mad magazine, that was freaking awesome. But as far as, like, realizing that we had created whatever you want to call it now, a classic or whatever it is, I mean, that didn't come till a while later, but we knew, obviously we had something cool once, we those early days,
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a slow build of, like, a series of oh shit moments. I mean, it depends on what scale you're talking about, because everything was brand new to us. We had no point of reference. We hadn't released a feature film before. So every moment was sort of like, oh shit, now we're in Sundance. Okay. Then we get to Sundance, and the movie is so popular that they open up the Eccles Theater to do a whole kind of dedicated screening at Eccles. And that was, like, I think my favorite screening, because the place was packed, and we were chill. We had sold the movie. We were relaxed, and everybody was super enthusiastic. And that was like another oh shit movie. Like, man, people are really liking the movie. And then hot on the heels of that whole experience was Cannes. So we freaking us knuckleheads are out in Cannes, like being treated like royalty out there. Like we're on a panel with like John Sayles and Spike Lee. Like, what the hell are we doing here? I mean, that was another oh shit moment for me. And, and then we're on the beach partying. They brought a whole bunch of trees out to make a fake woods in the south of France on the beach, and we're all smoking cigars, looking up at the boulevard. Like, I mean, it's just one oh shit moment after another, and it just kept growing, and we didn't really know where this was going to end or how much longevity it was had. We just sort of enjoying the ride. But like Ed said, I think it wasn't until quite a while later that Blair Witch, for me, sort of transitioned from just being a popular indie movie to something that was going to be remembered, and so-called like taught in film schools and stuff like that. I'd still I get a little tinge of I don't know, humility and excitement when I see Blair referenced in like a book or something, or someone references Blair on a show. Like, shit, they're still, it's like part of the kind of pop culture references now, and it still kind of blows me away.
So when it came to selling the IP, looking back 24 years, do you guys wish you would have kept it with how big it became? Or I remember, Ed, you were saying that you had bills to pay at the time, but
I mean, we had no choice. That wasn't even an option. I mean, like, I don't know what would have happened if we would have been like, no, we're going to keep, we're going to, there was no option because there wasn't any like self-distribution back then or any, there weren't, it was basically sell your film to one of these places or just don't, it was going to be bootlegged or, I don't know. There was our agents basically, we actually talked to them about keeping some of the rights, and they kind of like, I remember they kind of laughed at us a little bit. I remember that meeting with our lawyers and our agents. It just wasn't, that just wasn't, you basically, when you do a movie like that, you sell everything. But, it was, again, we had no other, we didn't really have a choice. And like I said, you mentioned, like we had bills to pay and people to pay and a lot of, just loans and stuff. So, that was kind of the way it was, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I look now, there's, the sequel, the video game, The Escape Room, and it was all from something you guys had created. Do you guys have any creative control in any of the subsequent Blair Witch stuff, or do they kind of just do their own thing with it?
They just basically do their own thing. I mean, I still kind of want to check out The Escape Room.
Yeah,
I think it's kind of funny, but and the game wasn't that bad. I kind of got lost in the middle of it, but I think it had a really good kind of atmosphere and tone to it. And I mean, look, we got so freaking lucky on our first movie out of the starting gate that it was the dream independent movie. I mean, I cannot complain one iota. We came away. We were able to make a living. We were able to have kind of nice upper middle class lives from that point, and it spawned a career for both Ed and I. I mean, you checked all the boxes, and now to sit there 25 years later and we're still talking about it. People are still enjoying the film. I've got my son who's 17, and he's got friends that want me to sign posters for him and stuff. It's like, I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. I have no complaints. It was the dream of every independent filmmaker, and we got to live it. And so can look back and say what shoulda, woulda, coulda, but that doesn't mean anything. I mean, we could have kept the movie to ourselves and buried it. We would not be having this conversation.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, exactly. We wouldn't even been doing anything after that.
Yeah.
Everything lined up for us. We made a ton of money. We were able to start our careers, and like Dan said, we're talking to you because of
Star Wars collections as evidence.
I started
in the background.
my crazy, my dumb Star Wars collections, and it's just like like Dan said, there really wasn't much of a downside. I mean, yeah, it would be nice to be able to like control the IP, but there's very few filmmakers that control their own IP. So it's not like we're an oddity. You know what I mean? But yeah, I mean, and the stuff they're doing, I mean, it's really cool to be to have stuff still happening that, is with the Blair Witch label. I mean, I think that's really cool. Again, I don't think Dan and I had ever imagined that we were going to have a movie that was still like having things come out from it 25 years later, So, exactly like what Dan said, we were very happy with what happened and the way it turned out. And, it was just, we totally lucked out. So.
Well, and there's so many lines of influence that came from it. I mean, obviously the shaky cam, found footage realm, but I think there is a line that we could draw from the success of Blair Witch to the modern day infatuation with true crime. There's a new true crime special on Netflix every other week. And, when I remember my mom and a couple of people in my family were going to see that movie in the theaters, and I hated it when she left me at my grandmother's house. And I was like, can I come with you guys? They're like, no, we're going to see a movie. I'm like, well, why can't I go? They're like, it's too scary. I found out later that they went to go watch The Blair Witch. So automatically in my head, I'm like, okay, this is a movie I'm not allowed to watch and I should see. You had to convince me.
Gotta go see it, yeah.
Yeah, you had to convince me at 10 years old that it wasn't real. You had to convince me. I was like, I read the website. I saw the pictures. These people are missing. And then inevitably someone spoiled that Santa wasn't real for me. And I was like, all right, well, I'm going to go to the internet, start looking up what is real.
Yeah, there's certainly a interesting compulsion people have for that sort of subgenre. I think Ed and I were cognizant of it back in those days because it affected us. Like I mentioned earlier about In Search Of and Legend of Boggy Creek and those kinds of projects and films and shows were played on that whole part of your brain. I had a UFO club growing up, and we'd go out and like do UFO research and whatnot. And so it's exciting and kind of scary and suspenseful, all wrapped up into one. And I think people really gravitate towards that. And when it's executed well, it can be incredibly effective and also very economical, because part of what works for that execution is that it is sort of low tech and it feels very natural and authentic. And if you have Tom Cruise in your pseudo documentary film, unless it's about Tom Cruise, it's not. I mean, it kind of takes you out of the realism. So it has a lot going for it, and I think many people sort of gravitate towards that genre and that conceit, and it can be really effective, especially in suspense and thriller and the horror genres. It's really effective.
Yeah, I mean, people love a good mystery, and and the fact that there is this real world connection to it is kind of what Dan's saying. That's what we picked off for Blair Witch. The idea that like this could be real if we frame it as being real. People like us will be more scared, will be more interested. People like you, Brandon, like you picked up on that. Oh, this is real. This is different than these other horror movies. So, but I love the true crime stuff, and I think that I don't know how much Blair Witch had to do with it. I mean, maybe it's cool to hear that you connected Blair Witch to this true crime stuff. But generally speaking, I think that like Blair Witch came at a time when like everybody was about to get camera. There was a lot. The birth of YouTube was about to happen. There was going to be, the video cameras were getting smaller and smaller. So there was this kind of, spreading out of the technology. And then, a few years later, everybody had a camera on their phone. So the idea of like, found footage or like, documentary kind of things just kind of blew up, and that generation grew up on shaky cam. So now like, the true crime stuff just kind of fits right into how that generation grew up of like blurring the lines between, fiction and reality.
Do you feel like it would be harder today to make something like this? I would think with social media and things going viral more prominently now than ever before that it would, but at the same time, I mean, people could ruin the ending of the movie or tell people it's fake just within one tweet.
Yeah,
it's kind of impossible. It's impossible now.
I never say never, but it's a tough question because I think it's more difficult to pull off something that you don't want the ending revealed because you'd have to completely shut down like all your internet connections because someone's going to spoil it for you in some way, you know. So that's, I think, is more difficult. But when I'm always amazed at how the public, or a good portion of the public, can be fooled into thinking something is real. I mean, misinformation is running rampant. So in some ways, it's easier than ever to kind of create something that looks legit and looks real, and a whole section of society will buy into it. I mean, that's, always, I think, been the case. And I still like to think, at the end of the day, for Blair Witch, aside from whether it was fact or fiction, or whether you believed in it or not when you went to see the movie, the film itself has to pay off. I mean, there's got to be at least a component where it is scary. Its pretense is it's going to be a scary movie, and it pays off. I think that was one of our frustrations with a lot of the films of the day, is that, they market themselves as a horror movie or whatever, and ultimately they just weren't really that scary. They were too self-referential or too slick or whatever. They got all caught up in their own thing, and it just wasn't scary. So regardless if the film is fact or fiction, or whether it can be pulled off now or not, the film you do has to pay off. If it's going to be a comedy, it better make people laugh. If it's going to be a drama, it needs to work on that level. Horror, I mean, so Blair Witch still is a scary movie for a lot of people. People see it today and they still, oh yeah, that freaking movie is scary. And so that, I think, there's no shortcut to that. There's no clever marketing campaign that's going to make a non-scary movie scary.
How do you? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask. I mean, how do you guys feel about some of the movies that came out inspired by Blair Witch, like Cloverfield and Paranormal Activity?
I dug them. I love both those films. I mean, there's, like every other subgenre, there's like just bad examples of found footage, but there's a lot of really great films, and I like that. The found footage tradition is still kind of developing. Like every once in a while, there's a good little found footage movie that comes out. Sometimes it blows up, and sometimes it doesn't. But it's still inspiring people, which is cool. And obviously it's changed, but I love seeing the kind of the younger filmmakers being inspired, at least in part, in some way, by our film, and kind of going out there and doing it. Because to me, like, I know what it takes to do a found footage movie, and I know what it takes to like make it compelling, and it's a lot of work. So I respect that kind of the filmmaking, and I've watched so many of them, and I just kind of find myself even if they're not great, there's just kind of something comforting about found footage movies for me. But yeah, there've been some great ones.
What kind of horror movies were you guys into growing up? I mean, was it slashers? I know you guys were saying atmospheric movies, but what was like your favorite?
Well, I mean, I had a lot of films that I really loved growing up. I think in the early days, it was like The Omen and The Exorcist and The Shining were definitely classics, and more offbeat films, B movies like It's Alive, stuff like that. I tend to kind of lean towards sort of the kind of suspenseful thriller type approaches to horror rather than the slasher types. I have nothing against slasher films. They have their own genre, but and then later on, I think it was, films like Jacob's Ladder and more psychological type films like that I really tend to gravitate towards. And Seven's another one I think is a brilliant film. And so they fall into that genre, but for me, you see a film like The Exorcist, and even today you look at it, it's just great writing. It's just amazing writing, amazing performances. The premise is so sound, it's sort of like a good film first and a kind of a genre film second. And those are the kinds of movies I tend to appreciate, kind of gravitate towards.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't like a particular fan of horror movies because they scared me, and I didn't really like to be scared as a kid. I still don't like to be scared. It's like every time there's a horror movie comes out that is like supposed to be scary, I'm always like, oh my God, I gotta, and I feel obliged that I have to sit through it, because I have to, I have to kind of keep my, finger on the pulse of what's happening in the genre. But when I was a kid, The Exorcist, like Dan said, was just the scariest thing to me. Like, for me, it was like, in my house, it was kind of, we approached it. My mom kind of gave us the info as like almost like a documentary. Like, this is what happens when you mess with, with dark powers. My mom was very religious, and it was always this, like, okay, if you believe in Jesus, then you have to believe in Satan. So I watched Exorcist when the first time it came out on TV in the late 70s as a kid, and I remember like I was young enough to like actually be sitting on my mom's lap. But movies like Amityville Horror, and then Jaws, of course, and like and that's one thing that Dan and I kind of really bonded with early on, is that we really did love the same kind of movies, Exorcist and The Shining, that kind of genre. And we really did not like we never talked about Halloween or Friday the 13th, or we didn't really, because I like those movies. I think there's a certain fun to slasher movies for sure if they're done well. But we definitely didn't gravitate towards that stuff. We gravitate more to atmospheric stuff, and then again the connection to like kind of the pseudo documentaries, and especially the show like In Search Of. That really was like, for me, that was the scariest thing on television, was that show, because it was, again, it blurred the lines between what was, fiction and reality, and it just really, really worked for me.
And like Legend of Boggy Creek too was another one of those films. I think Ed and I sort of bonded over, when I was a kid, that my dad took us to the drive-in, and that's where I watched it. And like the perfect environment to see a pseudo documentary about Bigfoot. And there was just something about the tone and the vibe of that movie that just had a big effect on me, and certainly had a big influence on us on Blair Witch, but we certainly bonded over that as well.
What have you guys been working on? I mean, is there anything coming out, anything that we could all look forward to, or maybe even a collaboration that was born today?
You never know. We're always coming up with knucklehead ideas. No, mostly for me, it's, I've been doing TV for the last almost 10 years now. Actually, tonight, my episode of FBI International airs, if you're a fan of that show. So just mostly TV shows. I did this show that I'm pretty excited about, called the Horror of Dolores Roach. That is an Amazon show that Blumhouse produced. I did the last 2 episodes, and that's coming out in the summer. I think in the summer. I've been talking to the head writer, and they're not sure, but they really love what they have. So I'm excited about that show. And then just staying in the TV space for now. And I have I always. I think Dan's the same way. I always have like these features kind of nibbling around, kind of, nibbling at my heels, or sometimes I'm pushing them, or I find a script that I really love, or somebody sends me a script that I really love. So I haven't done a feature in a long time, and I'm kind of itching to do one. But at the same time, I really, appreciate the space I'm in right now in television, and I have a great time, and it's very collaborative, and I meet great people, and I learn a lot. But other than the TV stuff, I have, that's kind of my lane. I've been kind of staying in that lane for a while now.
Yeah, I've been, working in this space. It sort of kind of found me more than I found it. But it started off before COVID. We were doing this sort of documentary project on the horse soldiers that went into Afghanistan after 9/11, and they were, looking for a more filmmaking kind of storyteller approach to their story. So we started working on that, and that sort of led to other things. I did this recut on this project called Mount Everest, Drop Zone Mount Everest, where they did a skydiving drop in the Mount Everest jump zone for, former kind of retired special operators guys. And then that led into this world record attempt that we just finished up called 777, which we did 7 skydives in 7 continents in less than 7 days. And that was a big whirlwind thing we did. And amazing fun, awesome projects. We're cutting and editing that now. And we've got another one that we're going to be doing over Drake's Passage, which is like that stretch of water between South America and Antarctica, which is supposed to be the most treacherous section of water there. They're going to be rowing a boat across it. So we're going to be covering that. But on the indie film side, I mean, my most recent film, Skyman, which is getting back to UFOs, it came out a couple years ago, right after COVID. And we did a theatrical drive-in release on that, which we were really proud of that movie. It was something kind of going back to my roots a little bit on Blair, just sort of making things simple and direct, small crew. And we had just a blast shooting that movie. And I just said to myself, if I could make movies like this forever, it would be great. It was just very much like in the spirit of Blair. It was very collegiate, and we just had a group of great friends around me and creative collaborators. And we just had a fun time doing it. And so I got another film that I'm writing now. It's a road movie, which is sort of a dark comedy. That's the same kind of approach. I might even use the same actors, but so yeah, I mean, you never stop wanting to create and do stuff like that. It's just really, I mean, to be honest with you, making an indie film is just hard. I mean, it is not, it is a young man's game, young woman's game. It is, you have to be fully committed for a couple of years, and it has to be a project you're really passionate about. And those don't come along real often for me. And it's a weird environment now for independent films as far as financing and distribution and all. It's kind of still up in the air, and nobody really knows what the rules are. So makes things challenging, not impossible, but definitely challenging. So you have to take all that into account. But yeah, I mean, I'll always have that itch to go out and do something, and creative and kind of independently minded, and love Ed to death and love working with Ed, and hope that we can find something that we align on. We could do something, because it's just a lot of fun working with him. And in a lot of ways, we end up pumping out something better than what we do on our own. So it's it's just one of those things that, now that we're a little older and wiser, and speaking for myself, a lot less hung up on having to like prove myself. I think we've kind of done that, been there, done that. I just feel more relaxed now about everything, and it's a good place to be. It's I think one upside about getting older, you just get a little bit more relaxed about shit.
The drugs are really good, man.
The drugs are top notch. You can afford them now.
yeah, exactly.
Well, let's get into some of these Crypt Notes. So here on the show, we like to end our interviews by running through some Crypt Notes, random trivia, rumors, or potential myths that have spread over the internet. And you guys are the experts, so let's find out if some of these are true. I'll just fire these off, and you guys just give your input on it.
All right.
Roger.
By the way, this is a side note. This will be cut out. Some of these are, very obvious that I think everybody knows, but we wanted to throw them in for, anybody who didn't know, or just those fun ones.
Sure.
There were alternate endings to the Blair Witch, including different fates for one or more of the characters.
Yeah, there was. We shot not really the fate of the characters. I mean, early on there was, we were kind of toying with the idea that we didn't know if we were going to pull Mike out or Josh out. We knew we were going to take one of them out, and I think somewhere along the line we decided to take Josh out instead of Mike. And then the ending, when we got to Sundance, we sold the film, and then Artisan came back to us and said, hey, we need to, people don't understand the ending and this and that. And they were like, would you guys reshoot the ending maybe? And they offered us some pretty good cash, and we hadn't been paid yet for our, we hadn't delivered the film
That's
yet.
Where they
we
get you.
Yeah, that's where they get you. They take months it took months for them to pay us. So they gave us, crazy more money than we had for the actual movie, and we came back to Maryland and shot some alternate endings. But we shot you can actually see them on the Blu-ray. I think just the different alternate endings of just the Heather coming down the stairs and what she sees. Mike and in different like he's hanging in one thing. He's like on a stick man. He's on a stick figure. And he's like tap dancing, I think, in one of them, right, Dan? He was like doing a little dance or something.
They were basically all the endings that we just shelved before shooting.
Yeah, and luckily they were, Artisan was cool with us and said, we'll go with your whatever ending you want, and we were like, we like the original ending, so, But yeah, we definitely thought about the ending a lot. Even during editing, we thought about that ending a lot. And during the shooting, we didn't come up with that ending till about 3 days before we shot it. So it was very stressful.
What's interesting about it is how anybody was confused about the original ending. I mean, wasn't it said that they were sent into the basement in twos and one had to face the corner?
Yes. Dan, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, the original cut of the movie didn't have that little tidbit in there where it was basically Mike standing in the corner, which visually is really creepy. I mean, I think Ed and I both agreed that something off kilter about it. I mean, one of the struggles with coming up with an ending, especially something as unconventional as Blair, is you wanted it to have a payoff, some kind of like you've been taking the audience on this journey for 80 or 90 minutes. So you can't just like cut to black and let the credits roll. So you wanted to have some sort of big payoff, but at the same time, you didn't want to undermine the premise, like reveal some witch in a costume or alien or whatever, which would have kind of blown the whole premise. So we had to strike a balance between something that would be really creepy and potentially scary, but still hold true to the kind of conceit where it was ambiguous enough that you couldn't really tell what was going on and debate it later on. And so the original cut of the film, I think, kind of skewed a little bit more to the ambiguous side. We did a test screening in New Jersey, which there was a lot of hands about the question of what was Mike doing in the corner and this and that. And even though it was scary, it just felt like a kind of a loose end. And then we just came up with the idea of like during those reshoots, we shot an additional interview in the town where the guy brings up the fact that Rusted Parr made the kids stand in the corner while he slaughtered the other ones in the room. And so we put that little bit in there, which helped to tie it all up. And that, I think, kind of put that ending right where it needed to be. But still, to this day, it's a very talked about, kind of controversial, polarizing aspect of the film. But that's, it's better than being boring, I think. So, but yeah, we did several different versions of an ending because of that ambiguity was scaring the studio, and honestly, it was scaring us too. But
yeah,
but I think that sometimes the less is more approach works. And despite all that extra shooting that we did, that one little interview segment in town sort of did the trick.
Yeah, I mean, we basically used the money that they gave us to not only shoot alternate endings, but to shoot an explanation, a little interview that would help us sell our original ending more.
Yeah.
So it was very, very devious of us, very underhanded the way we did that. But, again, Artisan was great. They were a great collaborator, and they could have, forced us to go with any ending they wanted, but they let us choose. So, we were really happy about that.
And I have to credit like Bill Block, who was co-president there of Artisan at the time. He really was championing the movie, and I think he really liked us as filmmakers, and he's that kind of guy. And so I think John Hageman and Bill Block were big fans of the film. They just liked the movie. So yeah, we did, and they were a fairly modest distribution company in those days. They had a lot to prove. They had done Pi the year before, which was pretty successful, but they weren't the Miramaxes or the big players on the space. Yeah. So they were a bit more collaborative than they otherwise may have been had it been a Miramax or something.
The bundle of sticks delivered to Heather and Mike, wrapped up with Joss's shirt, contained actual teeth and hair.
Yep, that was also something that like people don't, because we show it for so little amount of time, people don't know what it is. But yeah, people are like, is that a tongue? Is that an ear? I'm like, it was teeth. We got it from a dentist, and then we clipped some hair. I don't know if it was Josh's hair or maybe whatever, but yeah, it was hair and teeth, basically.
The teeth came from somebody that's their kind of a cameo in the movie. We'll never know where the teeth came from.
Yeah, they'll come back and sue us because we didn't get a release on their teeth.
Right.
I thought it was flesh the first time I saw it.
Yeah, it looks very fleshy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When the actors were running from their tents and Heather screams, "What the fuck is that?" There's an actual witch somewhere off screen.
not a witch, but this guy named David Poole, who was a friend of mine. Actually, I think dating my sister, my younger sister. And Dan and I had this idea for like, we wanted to show something in the movie in the woods. And we had this idea of like, wouldn't it be cool to like have like this, like a white specter, like a white figure kind of that you only catch in certain frames of the film, the film camera shot. And so we had this guy dress in like, long johns out, and like a white shirt, and spandex shirt, and like we put like something over his head to make him like just basically a white figure over his clothes. And it was freezing that night, and the poor guy ended up falling in the creek because we had to cross this log to like get to the campsite. So he was, it was like it was cold that night. So
it was like late October.
Yeah, it was October in Maryland, so it was cold. So, and then we shot the scene, and we had a little bit of a technical malfunction with the camera. So Dan and I, we actually went back and the DP Neil Fredericks, we fixed the camera, and we went back and shot basically a fake version of Heather, running, and she panned over, and we had David running next to the camera, about 10 or 15 feet away, kind of, just running and looking, and we were figuring, the camera's going to pick something up, and we're going to be able to like still, that frame and be like, look at this frame of there's like a ghostly figure in the footage. And we were so excited about it. That was like our big effect in the movie. And then we got back, because we didn't get the footage back for a few days at least, because we couldn't afford to, to actually, develop the footage on a timely manner. And we got the footage back, and there was no figure. There was nothing. We couldn't see anything. So it was a big disappointment to us, but it ended up, I think, working for the film that, we didn't see anything. But it would have been cool to capture. And still to this day, like we shot it, remember, Dan, we shot it at different, like we were like, all right, start at 15 feet, now get closer and closer.
Yeah, and we bracketed it and everything. It was like,
we bracketed. We were like looking to get that figure, and then there was a mystery to us, like why we didn't see anything. We thought that the light was going to reflect off his clothes, but it ended up being nothing. So it was a big disappointment to us. Yeah. So yeah, when she's saying, what the hell is that? She's actually seeing this guy in long johns and like, white pantyhose over his face running next to her.
Who's soaking wet.
Yeah, it was freezing. Yeah.
Now, did Heather's mother receive sympathy cards from people who believed that her daughter was actually dead or missing?
Well, I heard that she did, but I'm not sure if I'm just hearing a rumor myself.
I think I've read somewhere that she wrote that, that her mom was getting sympathy notes,
To promote discord between actors, they were deliberately given less food each day of shooting.
Of course.
That's an amazing tactic.
It's budgetarily expedient.
Yeah. I mean, we broke like every SAG rule, every union rule making this movie. I mean, it was just the reality of the situation. Like we were like, okay, they only came up here for 2 or 3 days. They're not going to have that much food. They probably ate most of their food the first 2 days, and now they're running out of food. So we naturally kind of like just, didn't feed them that much.
Real method.
Yeah, and we talked about the actors beforehand. Like, we lucked out so much on the fact that these actors, none of them like walked out after a couple of days and, well, you guys crazy, and just walked out of the movie. We definitely, the whole movie was basically, safely torturing these actors, safely as we could. And the fact that, they all were like cool and none of them like walked out and none of them were pissed off, they were eager to do it. And, it's a testament to who they were and who they are as actors and as performers. And, again, just points out the luck that we had in finding them.
Yeah, they were just down with everything. I mean, they were all about the project.
Yep.
One of the video cameras used by the actors was bought at Circuit City. After filming was completed, the producers returned the camera for a refund, making their budget money go even further.
Yeah, that's true. We had two cameras. One was, a picture camera, and we also used it to review the dailies. We wanted to make sure we kept the box and the receipts and all that kind of thing. And yeah, when we were done with it, we returned it and I think it was like $400 or something. That was
it was 500. It was $500, man. I remember that. It was we bought because
somebody has that camera. Somebody eventually bought that camera. I have no idea that it was used in the movie. An open box special.
Remember.
All right, just a few more for you guys. So to maintain the film's fear factor, the three main actors agreed to stay in character for the entire 8 days of filming. Periodically, if an actor had a break from character, then the remaining two actors also had to break from character, but only after collectively reciting their safety word, taco.
Yeah, I think that's true.
These are all hitters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it was probably a little bit looser than as described. I mean, we had a safe word, taco. I mean, one of the classic quotes, I think, from the production was from Greg Hale, where he told the actors, our primary concern is your safety, but your comfort is not. I paraphrase, but something to that effect. But yeah, there were times where they broke character, and look, they weren't running the cameras 100% of the time. There were certainly, there were times where they were sleeping and just chit chatting or whatever, but they were running up most of the time. And, but I think it ended up becoming a pretty good system because there really was no rule when to be on or be off, and so when they were just all playing in character, they all had to kind of fall into that zone. And Ed and I sort of would observe a lot of their performances just from the tree line. We had to kind of dress up in fatigues and stuff. So we would blend in with the background. So if the camera swung around, we would be just standing there watching these guys. So we had to hide, but also try to listen to how performances were going. And there were times that we had to kind of break in and say, okay, you're a little bit too hot this early on in the film, so let's dial the screaming down and the yelling down a little bit so you have something to build to later. So there were times that we had to break character for everyone, but and the actors did the same thing on their own. So it was a little bit of a kind of a instinctual thing through the process. But they did a great job, man. I mean, my hat's off to not only their performances and their acting chops, but embracing our method of shooting this movie was completely unorthodox. And, especially for a woman out in the woods with a bunch of dudes, not quite sure what's going on here. I think she even mentioned she brought a big, buck knife with her just to kind of protect herself in case anything went off the rails. But, but that was an immense amount of trust they put in us. And I'm always thankful for that.
Well, that actually goes in with one of our last ones, her bringing a knife with her. Matt Pat from Film Theory has proposed that the movie is really a fictional snuff film of Josh and Mike luring Heather into the woods to murder her.
Ooh, yet another theory.
Sure. I mean,
are you guys into these theories?
Yeah. I mean, it's cool to hear the theories, because, we thought about them a lot when we were making the movie and, trying to figure out what, if there is an explanation. I mean, I love that stuff. I mean, for us, it's, there has always been a supernatural aspect to what happened to them. And the proof really is the fact that, they enter a house at the end of the movie that was burned down in the 40s. So, there obviously has to be something supernatural. But yeah, I love the ideas where Josh was involved or Mike was involved or, whatever. I love that people are still kind of debating that.
Well, honestly, guys, you guys have been generous with your time and talking with me today. I'm sure after 24 years, it kind of gets redundant, but there are so many people who really care about this movie. I grew up with it. I, grabbed my mom's camera recorder, went into my own backyard and tried to recreate it. It didn't make nearly as much money, only about half of what Blair Witch did.
Right.
But, the movie taught me a lot.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate it.
It was fun, dude. Yeah.
I really appreciate you guys coming in today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, man. Yeah.